In 1900, America contained roughly 4,000 mansions, limestone palaces staffed by 60 servants, summer cottages with 70 rooms used for 8 weeks a year, Fifth Avenue lined with marble fortresses that rivaled anything in Paris or London. Their builders used granite and steel. They hired the finest architects alive. They built, they believed, for eternity. By 1950, 93% of it was gone. Not bombed, not flooded, not condemned. Exposed up, exposed sideways, and systematically taken apart by 3 forces that no amount of marble could withstand. This is the story of how America demolished its own palaces and why almost nobody tried to stop it. Chapter 1: The country that taxed nothing. For 41 years, from 1872 to 1913, the richest people in America kept every dollar they earned. No federal income tax, no capital gains tax, no estate tax. The government funded itself through tariffs and excise duties on whiskey and tobacco, and it left private wealth entirely alone. This was not an oversight, it was policy. The Civil War income tax expired in 1872, and Congress saw no reason to replace it. The Treasury ran surpluses most years. The country was growing. The railroads were expanding. And the men building the railroads were accumulating fortunes that had no precedent in the history of the Western world. Consider the numbers. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877 and left his son William roughly $200 million. Not adjusted for inflation. $200 million in 1877 dollars, when a skilled laborer earned $500 a year. William doubled it within a decade. Andrew Carnegie sold his steel company to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million, a figure so large that Morgan told him he was now the richest man in the world. John D. Rockefeller's personal fortune peaked near $900 million, roughly 2% of the entire American economy held by one man. And none of them owed the federal government a single cent on any of it. This is difficult to comprehend today. We live in a world where taxes are assumed, where every paycheck arrives smaller than expected, where April brings a ritual of forms and calculations. But for 4 decades after the Civil War, American wealth operated in what amounted to a fiscal vacuum. You made money. You kept money. What you did with it was your business. What they did with it was build. The logic was irresistible. If you possessed $50 million and the government claimed none of it, you faced a strange kind of problem. Banks paid modest interest. The stock market was unregulated and prone to panics. Real estate in Manhattan, however, was climbing steadily. And a house, unlike a bank account, announced your position to the world. It told your neighbors, your rivals, and your children exactly where you stood. So they built houses. Not modest houses, not even grand houses by the standards of previous generations. They built palaces. They imported limestone from Indiana and marble from Italy. They hired Richard Morris Hunt, the first American to study at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And they told him to build something the city had never seen. Hunt obliged. He built French chateaux on Fifth Avenue. He built Italian palazzos on Millionaire's Row. He built a cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, that contained 70 rooms and cost $11 million, and the family used it for 8 weeks each summer. The spending was staggering even by the standards of European aristocracy. The Duke of Marlborough maintained Blenheim Palace on an estate income of roughly £40,000 a year and considered himself perpetually short of funds. Cornelius Vanderbilt II spent more than that on flowers for a single party. The gap between American industrial wealth and European inherited wealth was not a difference of degree. It was a difference of kind. And these were men who generated cash faster than any mechanism in history could extract it from them. And the mechanism to extract it did not yet exist. This is the first fact you need to understand about the 4,000 mansions that once filled America's grandest streets. They were not built by reckless men. They were built by rational men responding to rational incentives in a system that had removed every financial constraint on personal construction. The marble was not vanity, it was investment. The 70-room cottage was not madness, it was math. When your fortune grows by millions each year and the tax rate is zero, the only question is what to build next. The answer, for one extraordinary generation, was everything. The scale of construction between 1880 and 1910 was without parallel. In Newport alone, more than 60 major summer cottages rose along Bellevue Avenue and Ocean Drive. On Fifth Avenue, mansions lined both sides of the street from the 30s to the 70s, their facades a catalog of European architectural history: French Gothic, Italian Renaissance, English Tudor, Beaux Art Classical. Long Island's North Shore filled with country estates sprawling across hundreds of acres. The Hudson Valley, the main line of Philadelphia, the North Shore of Chicago, the hills above San Francisco, all were colonized by families building on the same formula: unlimited income, zero taxation, and an absolute conviction that the arrangement was permanent. Nobody questioned the permanence. Why would they? The government showed no interest in taxing wealth. The economy rewarded capital at rates that seemed to accelerate with every passing year. The labor to build and maintain these houses arrived on every ship from Europe, and the culture celebrated the builders as the architects of American greatness. For 41 years, every signal pointed in one direction: build more, build bigger, build forever. The signals were about to reverse, but in 1900, standing at the peak, no one could see the cliff. Chapter 2: Building Versailles on Fifth Avenue. Alva Vanderbilt did not want a home. She wanted a weapon, and she hired the best architect in America to build it. The year was 1879. Alva was 26 years old, married to William Kissam Vanderbilt, and shut out of New York society by Mrs. Caroline Astor, who considered railroad money vulgar. Alva's solution was not to wait for an invitation. It was to build something so spectacular that refusing to attend would be more embarrassing than showing up. She commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design a French chateau at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street. The Petit Chateau, as it became known, cost $3 million. It featured a grand staircase carved from Caen limestone, a dining room that seated 200, and a facade that looked like it had been transported stone by stone from the Loire Valley. When it opened on March 26, 1883, with a costume ball attended by 1,200 guests, Mrs. Astor came. The Vanderbilts were in. The house had done its work. But the Petit Chateau was only the opening salvo. Within 2 decades, Manhattan's elite turned Fifth Avenue into an arms race measured in cubic feet of marble. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built a block-long mansion at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street. 130 rooms, the largest private residence ever built in Manhattan. His wife Alice filled it with tapestries, bronzes, and a pipe organ. George Vanderbilt looked at what his brothers were building in New York and decided he needed something larger. He bought 125,000 acres in the mountains of North Carolina and commissioned Hunt to design Biltmore, a 250-room French Renaissance chateau that remains the largest private home in America. Construction began in 1889. More than 1,000 workers labored for 6 years. The house required its own railroad spur, its own brick kilns, its own lumber operation. The final cost approached $10 million, a sum equivalent to roughly $350 million today. The scale defied reason. In Newport, Hunt built Marble House for Alva Vanderbilt's summer use. $11 million for a house used 8 weeks a year. 500,000 cubic feet of marble from Italy, shipped in 17 railroad cars for the entrance hall alone. Across Bellevue Avenue, Cornelius Vanderbilt II commissioned the Breakers, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace. When the original wooden structure burned in 1892, Cornelius ordered Hunt to rebuild it fireproof. The new breakers rose in 2 years. 30 types of marble, mosaic floors designed in Paris and assembled in Newport, a kitchen large enough to serve 250 guests, platinum leaf on the ceiling of the music room because gold was considered insufficient. And then there was William Andrews Clark. Clark was a copper baron from Montana, one of the richest men in the American West, and he decided to build the most extravagant private residence New York had ever seen. At 965th Avenue, Clark began construction on a mansion that would take 14 years to complete. 121 rooms, 4 art galleries, a private theater seating 250, a swimming pool lined with marble, an underground railroad specifically designed to transport coal into the basement boilers without the noise and dirt reaching the household above. The cost exceeded $7 million. Clark moved in around 1911, and he was 72 years old. The house was, by almost any measure, absurd, but Clark was not unique. He was simply the most extreme expression of a phenomenon that had overtaken an entire class. Between 1895 and 1905, the grandest decade of American residential construction, hundreds of mansions rose along Fifth Avenue, up the Hudson Valley, across Long Island's North Shore, and along the cliffs of Newport. Architects could not work fast enough. Quarries ran at capacity. Ships brought carved mantelpieces, stained glass windows, and medieval tapestries across the Atlantic by the hundreds. The cost of a single mansion would have built a small town. Marble House cost $11 million. That sum could have constructed 500 modest homes at the period's average building cost. Like the breakers cost roughly $7 million. Biltmore cost between $6 and $10 million, depending on which accounting you trust. Clark's Folly exceeded $7 million. These were not investments. They generated no income. They were pure expenditure, money converted into stone and permanently consumed. A family that spent $10 million on a house did not possess a $10 million asset. It possessed a $10 million obligation because the house demanded constant spending to survive. Nobody thought of it that way. In the zero-tax era, with fortunes growing faster than houses could consume them, the obligations seemed trivial. Maintenance was a rounding error on a fortune of $100 million. The annual coal bill, the servant wages, the repairs, all of it vanished into the vastness of untaxed industrial income. The builders saw permanence because they could not imagine the money stopping. The builders believed they were founding dynasties. They carved family crests into limestone facades. They planted copper beeches that would take a century to reach maturity. They specified materials chosen for their permanence: granite foundations, steel beams, slate roofs rated to last 300 years. They were building, they were certain, forever. But the buildings needed something far more fragile than stone to survive. They needed people. Chapter 3: The Invisible City inside the walls. Behind every ballroom, behind every gilded ceiling, there was a second house that no guest was ever meant to see. The grand rooms were designed for display. Crystal chandeliers, imported marble, hand-painted murals commissioned from European artists. But behind the silk wallpaper, concealed by hidden doors and narrow staircases, existed a parallel architecture. Servant corridors ran the length of every floor, allowing maids, footmen, and butlers to move invisibly through the house without crossing the family's path. At the breakers, 33 servant rooms occupied the upper floors and basement, connected by a network of back stairs so elaborate that a servant could travel from the kitchen to any bedroom in the house without once entering a hallway visible to guests. This was not accidental. It was designed. The great architects of the Gilded Age were masters of dual architecture. They created one house for beauty and another house for labor, and they stitched the two together with an ingenuity that rivaled any engineering feat of the era. At Biltmore, the servant infrastructure was a small city. 80 servants worked the house at full operation. The kitchens alone occupied thousands of square feet, divided into separate rooms for roasting, pastry, cold storage, and dishwashing. A mechanical conveyor system moved food and dishes between floors. A laundry facility the size of a commercial operation handled linens for 250 rooms. The electrical system, one of the first residential installations in America, required a dedicated staff to maintain. The heating plant consumed coal by the trainload. 150 tons of coal burned each winter to keep the house warm, delivered by rail to the estate's own depot. Clark's mansion at 965th Avenue pushed the invisible infrastructure to its logical extreme. The underground coal railroad was an engineering marvel in its own right. A miniature rail system that carried fuel from the street to the boilers without a trace of soot reaching the main floors. The house contained not one kitchen, but 3, each serving a different function. A staff of over 100 moved through the building on routes specifically designed to be invisible to the family and their guests. These hidden systems were the true cost of the Gilded Age mansion, not the marble, not the gold leaf, not the commissioned murals. The real expense was the permanent army of human beings required to operate the building every single day. Consider the servant economy at its peak. In 1900, roughly 16% of New York City's workforce was employed in domestic service. Across America, more than 2 million people worked as servants, cooks, maids, laundresses, valets, coachmen, and gardeners. The majority were immigrants. Irish women dominated the kitchens of the Northeast. Scandinavian women staffed the laundries. English and French butlers managed the households. They worked 14 to 16-hour days. They earned between $200 and $400 a year. They lived in the attic rooms and basement quarters of the houses they served. Without them, none of it worked. A 70-room mansion without servants was not a house. It was a museum with no staff, a hotel with no guests, a machine with no operators. Every fireplace needed tending. Every floor needed polishing. Every meal needed cooking, serving, and cleaning. The silver needed daily treatment. The windows needed washing. The gardens needed planting. The horses needed feeding. The carriages needed cleaning. And the stables needed mucking. A family of 4 might live in a mansion designed for 200 guests and operated by 50 servants. The ratio was not accidental. It reflected the truth that these houses were not homes in any modern sense. They were institutions. They operated like small luxury hotels, and they required a permanent staff to keep them running. The hierarchy was rigid and exact. A butler managed the household. A housekeeper managed the female staff. Below them, a chain of authority descended through footmen, parlor maids, chambermaids, laundresses, kitchen maids, and scullery girls. Each had a defined role. Each had a defined place. The footmen served at table and answered the door. The parlor maids dusted the public rooms. The chambermaids made the beds and emptied the wash basins. The laundresses worked in the basement, often in conditions of extreme heat and dampness. The scullery girls cleaned pots and scrubbed floors. At the bottom of the hierarchy, the coal men shoveled fuel into boilers in underground rooms invisible to everyone. The total cost of operating a major mansion in 1900 ran between $40,000 and $100,000 annually. Staff wages accounted for roughly half. The rest went to coal, ice, food, laundry supplies, repairs, insurance, and property taxes. This was before any money was spent on entertaining, which could easily double the annual budget. A family that hosted the Newport social season, with its dinners, balls, and garden parties, might spend another $50,000 in a single summer. In 1900, this seemed entirely normal. The labor was available. The wages were low. The immigration pipeline from Europe delivered a fresh supply of workers every year. And the families paying the wages had fortunes that grew faster than any household could spend them. Nobody asked what would happen if the labor disappeared. Nobody asked what would happen if the money was taxed. Nobody asked what would happen if the culture turned against the entire enterprise. They would find out soon enough. Chapter 4, February 3rd, 1913. The 16th Amendment did not look like a death sentence, but it gave Congress the one power that would eventually destroy 4,000 buildings. On February 3rd, 1913, the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified. It contained a single operative sentence, granting Congress the power to tax income from whatever source derived. The first income tax law passed later that year imposed a rate of 1% on incomes above $3,000 and a top rate of 6% on incomes above $500,000. 6%. On paper, it was almost irrelevant. A man earning $1 million would owe roughly $42,000 in federal income tax. Painful, perhaps, but hardly ruinous. The Vanderbilts could lose $42,000 in the cushions of their furniture and never notice. The Astors spent more than that on a single dinner party. But the mechanism mattered infinitely more than the rate. Before 1913, taxing personal income required a constitutional amendment. After 1913, raising the rate required only a vote in Congress. And Congress, as it turned out, was about to have excellent reasons to vote. The first reason was war. When America entered World War I in 1917, the government needed money on a scale it had never imagined. The top marginal tax rate, which had stood at 7% in 1915, jumped to 15% in 1916, then to 67% in 1917. Then to 77% in 1918, 77% in the 1877%. In the span of 3 years, the tax rate on the highest incomes had increased by more than a factor of 10. A fortune that once grew unchecked was now being claimed in its upper reaches at a rate of more than 3/4 on the dollar. The war ended. The rates came down. But they never returned to their original levels. Throughout the 1920s, the top rate hovered between 25 and 46%. This was the era of prosperity, the Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties. And yet, Even during the boom years, the wealthiest families were operating under a tax burden that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Then came 1916's second innovation, the federal estate tax. When a wealthy person died, the government now claimed a percentage of their entire accumulated fortune before a single dollar passed to the next generation. The initial rate was 10% on estates above $5 million. It would climb steadily for the next 3 decades. Trace the impact on a single family a day. The Vanderbilts had accumulated roughly $300 million by the turn of the century. Cornelius Vanderbilt II died in 1899, before the income tax, before the estate tax, and his estate passed intact to his heirs. His son Alfred died in the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. By then the estate tax existed, but at low rates. When Alfred's brother Reginald died in 1925, the tax bite was substantially larger. When Reginald's generation finished dying, the family fortune that had once been the largest in America had been divided, taxed, divided again, and taxed again until no single heir possessed enough to maintain the houses their grandfather had built. This was the mathematics of erosion. The income tax reduced the annual flow of money available for maintenance. The estate tax reduced the capital base each time it passed between generations. Together, they created a financial vice that tightened with every death and every congressional vote. And Congress kept voting. The Great Depression brought revenue demands that dwarfed even the wartime need. The top marginal rate rose to 63% in 1932, then 79% in 1936, then 81% in 1940. When World War II arrived, it climbed again, 88% in 1942, 94% in 1944, 94 cents on every dollar earned above $200,000. Let that number settle. A family that earned $500,000 in 1944 kept roughly $212,000 after federal income tax. Out of that, they paid state taxes, property taxes, and the cost of maintaining whatever houses they still owned. A mansion that required $50,000 a year in basic upkeep now consumed a quarter of the family's after-tax income. A mansion that required $100,000 consumed nearly half. The tax code did not merely squeeze the mansion owners. It made the mansions mathematically impossible. Consider what the tax code meant in practice for a family maintaining a major estate. A house like the Breakers required roughly $50,000 to $75,000 per year in basic operating costs. Servants, coal, repairs, insurance, and property taxes. In 1900, when the tax rate was 0, a family with a $5 million fortune earning 5% annually could fund these expenses from investment income alone, with $200,000 left over. By 1944, that same family would retain, after federal income tax, at 94%, barely enough to pay the property tax, let alone the staff. The arithmetic was not approximate, it was exact. The tax code had turned mansions from affordable luxuries into financial traps. The estate tax compounded the destruction across generations. The Vanderbilts had accumulated roughly $300 million by the turn of the century. Each death triggered a tax payment that reduced the principal. Each generation inherited less. Each generation faced higher rates. By the 1930s, no single Vanderbilt heir possessed enough wealth to maintain any of the major houses their grandparents had built. The family that had once been the richest in America could no longer afford the homes that symbolized their fortune. The $16 million fortune that once funded construction, maintenance, and an army of servants now generated, after taxes, barely enough to keep the roof in repair. The estate tax ensured that each successive generation inherited a smaller base. The income tax ensured that whatever remained produced less spending power each year. The trajectory was a descending spiral with a fixed endpoint, the moment when the tax bill on the house exceeded the family's ability to pay it. For dozens of families, that moment arrived in the 1920s. For hundreds more, it arrived in the 1930s. For the rest, the wartime rates of the 1940s ended the question entirely. The 16th Amendment had given Congress a lever. Congress had pulled it further and further for 31 years. And the 4,000 mansions, built in a world where that lever did not exist, were being crushed beneath its weight. But the tax code was only the first of 3 simultaneous attacks. The second struck even closer to the foundations. Chapter 5. The Servants Who Never Came Back. World War I did not just take soldiers. It emptied the kitchens, the laundry rooms, and the servant corridors of every grand house in America. The war created something that domestic service could not compete with: factory jobs. Munitions plants, shipyards, and steel mills needed workers by the hundreds of thousands, and they paid wages that made a servant's salary look pitiful. A maid earning $300 a year could walk into a factory and earn twice that in half the hours, with her evenings free and no one inspecting her uniform. Thousands did exactly that, and when the war ended, they did not come back. The factory economy had rewritten the labor calculus permanently. Before the war, domestic service was the largest single category of female employment in America. By 1920, it had begun a decline that would never reverse. Factory work offered higher pay, fixed hours, weekends off, and something more intangible but equally important: dignity. A factory worker punched a clock and went home. A servant lived at the mercy of her employer 24 hours a day, subject to rules governing her dress, her speech, her visitors, and her days off. The war had shown millions of women that an alternative existed. But the labor drain from domestic service was about to get dramatically worse. In 1921, Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act, capping annual immigration from any country at 3% of the number of people from that country already living in America. In 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act tightened the restriction further, reducing the quota to 2% and basing it on the 1890 census, which effectively slashed immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe to a trickle. The impact on the servant supply was catastrophic. For decades, the mansions of the Gilded Age had run on immigrant labor. Irish women cooked. German women cleaned. English butlers managed the household. The immigration pipeline had been so reliable that families never questioned whether the next generation of servants would be available. They assumed, as they assumed about everything, that the supply was permanent. The numbers tell the story. George Stigler documented the collapse. The number of foreign-born female domestic servants fell from 416,000 in 1910 to 266,000 in 1920, a loss of 150,000 workers in a single decade. The total percentage of working women employed in domestic service dropped from 52% to 28%. The servant question became a staple of newspaper columns and magazine articles throughout the 1920s. Families that once employed 40 servants found they could hire 20. Families that employed 20 found they could hire 10. Wages rose sharply as supply contracted, further straining the finances of families already reeling from the income tax. A cook who earned $300 a year in 1900 might command 800 by 1925. A butler's salary doubled. A full staff that cost $20,000 annually in 1900 cost $40,000 by the mid-1920s. And even at higher wages, the workers were not there. This was the second structural crisis, and in many ways it was more devastating than the tax code. A family could, theoretically, pay higher taxes and still maintain a mansion if they had the staff to run it. But a mansion without staff was simply uninhabitable, and you could not live in a 70-room house without someone to clean the 70 rooms. You could not heat a house that burned 150 tons of coal a year without someone to shovel the coal. You could not host a dinner for 200 without someone to cook, serve, and wash the dishes. The mansions had been designed as machines that consumed human labor at industrial scale. Every room, every fireplace, every bathroom, every kitchen represented a demand for hands and hours. The architects had drawn plans assuming a permanent class of people would be available to operate their creations. The Immigration Acts destroyed that assumption. On Long Island's Gold Coast, the crisis was already visible by the mid-1920s, and estates that had employed 50 gardeners and 20 household staff were operating with skeleton crews. Entire wings of houses were closed off because there was no one to maintain them. Gardens that had won prizes in 1910 were overgrown by 1925. The North Shore, which had been one of the densest concentrations of great estates in America, was beginning to feel the first signs of the abandonment that would consume it within 2 decades. In Newport, the situation was no better. The summer colony that had been the pinnacle of American social life was thinning every season. Fewer houses opened, fewer parties were held. The families that still came found themselves competing for a shrinking pool of workers who could demand higher wages and better conditions. The entire economy of the town, which had been built around serving the mansions, was contracting. The great houses had been designed for a world with unlimited cheap labor. That world had ended, and the houses had no mechanism to adapt. You could not automate a gilded ceiling. You could not install a machine to polish silver. You could not replace a staff of 40 with a vacuum cleaner and a washing machine. The houses needed people, and the people were gone. The technological alternatives were pitiful. Electric vacuum cleaners existed by the 1920s. Washing machines were available. Gas ranges replaced the coal-fired kitchen stoves. But these improvements were designed for a 6-room house, not a 70-room mansion. A vacuum cleaner might save one maid's time in one room. A mansion with 40 bedrooms still required an army. The fundamental problem was not the technology of housework, it was the scale of the houses. They had been designed to consume labor, and no machine could replicate the work of 30 human beings maintaining a building the size of a small hotel. Some families tried to adapt by closing wings, sealing rooms, covering furniture with dust cloths. A house designed for 80 servants might be kept marginally habitable with 15, but the closed wings deteriorated. Pipes froze, plaster cracked, moisture invaded. A mansion half maintained was a mansion half dying. The compromise between full operation and abandonment was slow decay, and slow decay was expensive in its own way, because the repairs deferred today became the catastrophes of tomorrow. The tax code had attacked the wealth. The labor crisis had attacked the operations. But one more force was gathering, and it would attack something even more fundamental: the desire to live in a mansion at all. Chapter 6: When Wealth Became Shameful. The Depression did not merely shrink the fortunes, it made the mansions themselves socially radioactive. Mark Twain had coined the term Gilded Age in 1873 as satire. For decades, no one much cared. The families who built the mansions did not read their own reviews. They were too busy building. But the stock market crash of 1929 and the catastrophe that followed turned Twain's joke into an accusation. Suddenly, the marble palaces on Fifth Avenue were not symbols of American achievement. They were symbols of American inequality, monuments to greed built while ordinary people starved. The cultural transformation was swift and brutal. In 1928, a man who owned a mansion was admired. By 1933, he was despised. The change was not gradual. It arrived with the unemployment lines, the bread lines, the Hoovervilles in Central Park, the bank failures that wiped out the savings of millions. A generation that had grown up admiring the rich now blamed them. Franklin Roosevelt understood this shift and accelerated it. His rhetoric was deliberate. He spoke of economic royalists and privileged princes. He framed the Depression as a moral failure of the wealthy class, not merely an economic accident. His Revenue Act of 1935, known informally as the wealth tax, raised the top income tax rate to 79% and imposed a graduated corporate tax designed to punish large concentrations of corporate power. The message was unmistakable. Wealth was not just being taxed, it was being punished. Roosevelt briefly entertained an even more radical proposal, a 100% marginal tax rate on all income above $25,000. The proposal never passed, but its existence in serious political discourse reveals how completely the cultural landscape had shifted. A generation earlier, the idea of taxing income at all was controversial. Now, the idea of confiscating every dollar above a middle-class salary was within the bounds of legitimate debate. The families that still occupied their mansions received the message clearly. Conspicuous display, once the entire point, became dangerous. Families that had competed to throw the most lavish parties now competed to avoid attention. Houses were maintained quietly. Entertaining was scaled back. The great balls and banquets that had defined the social calendar simply stopped. The newspapers, which had once reported on mansion construction with admiration, now reported on it with contempt. Columnists described the great houses as monuments to greed. Cartoonists drew fat men in top hats sitting on marble thrones, while children begged in the streets below. The mansions had been built, in part, as public statements. Now the public was listening, and the answer was fury. Families responded by retreating from visibility. Some donated to charities conspicuously, hoping to deflect criticism. Others closed their houses and moved to smaller quarters. A few attempted the impossible trick of maintaining a mansion while pretending it did not exist, drawing curtains, dismissing most of the staff, and living in 3 rooms of a 70-room house. The financial squeeze was unrelenting. Consider the breakers. By the 1930s, the property tax alone on the Newport mansion reached $83,000 a year. Adjusted for inflation, that figure exceeds $1 million in today's terms. This was before a single servant was paid, before a pound of coal was delivered, before a broken window was repaired. The tax bill alone, on a house that generated no income, was more than most Americans earned in a lifetime. Alice Gwynn Vanderbilt, the widow of Cornelius II, lived on in the house she and her husband had built. But the fortune that once seemed inexhaustible was shrinking. She alternated years between New York and Newport because she could not afford to maintain both households simultaneously. The house at 5th Avenue and 57th Street, the largest private residence in Manhattan, consumed money at a rate that terrified her children. The breakers consumed money at a rate that terrified everyone. Alice buried 4 of her 7 children. She watched the fortune dissolve. She watched the world that had produced the fortune turn against everything it represented. She lived to see the house on Fifth Avenue sold and demolished. She lived to see her family name become a synonym for excess. She died in 1934, 79 years old, having witnessed the entire arc from zenith to collapse. Her story was not unique, it was the template. Across America, the pattern repeated. A fortune built in the zero tax era. A house built to match the fortune. Taxes eroding the fortune. Labor vanishing from the house. And then the cultural shift that made the house not merely expensive, but embarrassing. The shame was perhaps the most destructive force of all, because it removed the will to fight. A family under financial pressure might economize, find new income sources, or borrow against assets to maintain a beloved home. But a family under cultural pressure lost the desire to maintain it. Why struggle to keep a house that your neighbors resented, that the press ridiculed, and that the government seemed determined to punish? The cultural shift did not just make the mansions expensive, it made them unwanted. And an unwanted house, no matter how magnificent, is a house already condemned. The children of the builders felt this most acutely. They had grown up in the mansions, but came of age in a world that despised them. Many were eager to sell, to escape the burden of properties that attracted criticism and consumed fortunes. The generational transfer of wealth was simultaneously a generational transfer of attitude. The grandchildren of men who had spent millions building palaces now spent thousands hiring lawyers to dispose of them. By the late 1930s, all 3 supports had failed simultaneously. The money was being taxed at rates approaching confiscation. The labor had vanished behind immigration walls and factory gates. And the culture had declared war on the very idea of visible wealth. The mansions stood as they always had, in limestone and marble and granite. But the systems that sustained them were dead. What followed was not a decline. It was a demolition. Chapter 7. The year Fifth Avenue fell. In 1926, the 3 of the most famous houses in America were demolished in a single year, and the wrecking ball was just getting started. The first to fall was the Cornelius Vanderbilt mansion at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street. 130 rooms, the largest private home in Manhattan. The house where Alice Vanderbilt had raised her children, hosted presidents, and presided over a world that no longer existed. The family sold it. Wrecking crews reduced it to rubble. In its place rose Bergdorf Goodman, a department store. The transaction was clean and merciless. The land beneath the house was worth more as commercial real estate than the house was worth as a home. The second was the Petit Chateau. Alva Vanderbilt's social weapon, the house that had conquered Mrs. Astor and opened the doors of New York society to the Vanderbilt name, came down the same year. An office tower replaced it. The carved limestone, the Caen stone staircase, the ballroom where 1,200 guests had danced in 1883, all of it was dismantled and carted away. The third was the Astor Mansion, replaced by a synagogue. 3 landmarks of an entire era, gone in 12 months. The economics of each demolition told the same story. Manhattan real estate values had risen so dramatically that the land beneath a mansion was worth far more than the mansion itself. A block of Fifth Avenue that held one family's home could generate millions in commercial rent if developed into offices or retail space. The mansion was not just expensive to maintain, it was expensive to own because every year it occupied, that land was a year of lost commercial income. This is the calculation that destroyed Fifth Avenue. Not neglect, not decay, not poverty, pure arithmetic. A mansion that cost $3 million to build sat on land now worth $5 million. The rational act was demolition. The speed of the transformation was breathtaking. In 1900, Fifth Avenue from 40th Street to 72nd Street was a continuous wall of private residences, each more elaborate than the last. By 1930, that same stretch held department stores, office towers, hotels, and apartment buildings. 30 years to erase a residential boulevard that had taken 50 years to build. The demolitions were not quiet affairs. They were public spectacles. New Yorkers gathered to watch the wrecking crews dismantle mansions that had been landmarks for decades. Photographers documented the process. Newspapers covered the sales and the demolitions with a mixture of nostalgia and satisfaction, as if the city were shedding an old skin. William Andrews Clark died in 1925. His monument at 965th Avenue, the 121-room palace that had taken 14 years to build, was sold for less than $3 million. Within 2 years, it was demolished. 14 years to build, 14 years to occupy, 2 years to erase. The life cycle of the most expensive private home in New York history spanned roughly 3 decades from groundbreaking to oblivion. Clark's mansion became a kind of parable. A copper baron had spent $7 million in 14 years creating a home that no one else wanted. The art galleries were emptied. The private theater was gutted. The underground coal railroad, that marvel of domestic engineering, was ripped from the earth. The marble swimming pool was smashed. The 121 rooms that had taken an army of craftsmen more than a decade to finish were reduced to debris in weeks. The demolitions cascaded through the 20s and into the 30s. Block by block, Fifth Avenue shed its residential character. The Astor houses fell. The Gould houses fell. The Belmont mansion fell. The Whitney mansion fell. Each demolition followed the same script. Family sells, developer buys, wrecking crew arrives, commercial building rises. The process was so efficient that entire blocks could be transformed in a single year. The human element was sometimes poignant, sometimes absurd. Auction houses conducted sales of contents before the wrecking began, and hand-carved mantelpieces that had cost thousands to commission sold for hundreds. Stained glass windows went for a fraction of their creation cost. Entire rooms, paneled in mahogany or walnut, were offered at prices that would have been insulting a generation earlier. The buyers were hotels, restaurants, and occasionally museums looking to salvage fragments of a vanishing world. There was a particular cruelty in the auction process. The contents of a mansion, accumulated over decades, were assigned lot numbers and sold to the highest bidder over the course of an afternoon. A woman's bedroom set, chosen with care 30 years earlier, sold in 3 minutes. A library of leather-bound books, collected by a man who had read every one, was knocked down to a dealer who wanted the shelves. The dispersal reduced lives to commerce and memories to merchandise. What had been a home became an inventory. The wrecking crews themselves became a familiar sight on Fifth Avenue. Teams of laborers, many of them immigrants, doing the same kind of manual work that had built the houses a generation earlier, now took them apart. The process typically began at the roof, stripping slate and copper, then worked downward floor by floor. Interiors were gutted first. Then the exterior walls came down, revealing the skeletal structure of steel and masonry that had been hidden behind the facades. Finally, the foundations were dug out, leaving a raw pit in the earth where a palace had stood the month before. By 1930, Midtown Fifth Avenue had been almost entirely stripped of its mansions. The marble fortresses that had lined the avenue from Washington Square to Central Park were gone, replaced by the commercial architecture of a modern city. A street that had once been the most exclusive residential address in the Western world was now a shopping district. But the demolitions of the 1920s were only the first wave. They were driven by economics, land value exceeding building value. The second wave, which began in the 30s and crested in the 40s, would be driven by something darker. Not opportunity, desperation. Chapter 8, 94 cents on every dollar. By 1944, the federal government claimed 94 cents of every dollar a wealthy family earned above $200,000, and the mansions began dying by the hundreds. The second demolition wave was fundamentally different from the first. In the 1920s, mansions on Fifth Avenue were demolished because the land was more valuable without them. The owners profited from the demolition. They sold high. They moved on. The second wave offered no such consolation. Beginning in the mid-1930s and accelerating through the 40s, mansions across Long Island, the Hudson Valley, Newport, and the suburbs of every major American city were demolished, not because someone wanted the land, but because no one could afford the house. Long Island's Gold Coast was the epicenter. This strip of the North Shore, stretching from Great Neck to Cold Spring Harbor, had been one of the densest concentrations of great estates in the world. In 1920, nearly 300 major estates lined the coastline. They were the country houses of Manhattan's elite, summer retreats and weekend compounds built with the same ambition and extravagance as the city mansions. By 1950, 2/3 of them were gone. The mathematics were identical everywhere. A family that had built an estate in 1905, when the income tax did not exist, now faced a 94% marginal rate on its highest income. The estate generated no revenue. It consumed revenue, property taxes, insurance, utilities, staff, maintenance, groundskeeping. A modest estate might cost $30,000 a year to maintain. A large one could cost over $100,000. Against a tax rate that left 6 cents on every dollar above $200,000, these costs were devastating. Beacon towers fell. Yet this was the great Gothic castle that Alva Belmont, formerly Alva Vanderbilt, had built on a bluff overlooking Long Island Sound. Modeled on a medieval keep, it had been one of the most recognizable silhouettes on the North Shore. After Belmont's death, no buyer could be found who could afford its upkeep. It was demolished in 1945. Harbor Hill fell. Designed by McKim, Mead, and White for Clarence Mackay, it had been called the finest country house in America. The grounds alone covered 600 acres. After Mackay's fortune evaporated in the crash, the estate was sold, subdivided, and demolished. A suburban housing development replaced it. Where one family had once walked through formal gardens stretching to the horizon, in rows of identical houses now lined cul-de-sacs named after the trees that had been cut down to build them. The pattern was merciless and repetitive. Estate sold, usually for a fraction of construction cost. Buyer attempts to operate it, fails. Property subdivided, house demolished. suburban homes built on the grounds. An estate that had cost $2 million to build might sell for $200,000. An estate that had taken 5 years to construct might be demolished in 5 weeks. Idle Hour, the Vanderbilt estate in Oakdale, was converted to a university campus. Laurelton Hall, Louis Comfort Tiffany's masterpiece of Art Nouveau design on Cold Spring Harbor, burned and was demolished, its extraordinary glass panels and decorative elements scattered to collectors and museums. Winfield Hall, the limestone palace built for F.W. in Woolworth, passed through a succession of owners who could not afford its upkeep. Estate after estate followed the same trajectory: grandeur, decline, disposal. The economics of impossibility at 94% taxation were inescapable. Consider a family with a gross income of $500,000, which was a substantial income even by Gold Coast standards. After federal income tax at the 1944 rates, they retained approximately $212,000. After state taxes, roughly $180,000. The property tax on a large estate might consume $30,000. Insurance, another $10,000. Basic maintenance, even with a skeleton crew of 10 servants at modest wages, another $50,000. Heating, electricity, and groundskeeping, another $20,000. The family was left with roughly $70,000 to live on, from a gross income of $500,000. And that assumed no major repairs. A new roof on a mansion could cost more than the family's entire remaining income. A fire could bankrupt them. Even a harsh winter that cracked pipes and damaged masonry could push the budget into deficit. The demolitions accelerated through World War II. The war imposed additional financial strains, but it also provided emotional cover. Families that might have fought to save their houses in peacetime surrendered them with less resistance during wartime. Metal was needed for the war effort. Land was needed for military purposes. The act of demolition could be framed as patriotic rather than humiliating. The post-war housing boom delivered the final blow. Returning soldiers needed homes, and the GI Bill made mortgages affordable. Developers looked at the great estates with their hundreds of acres of prime suburban land and saw not mansions, but subdivision opportunities. The math was simple and devastating. A 50-acre estate could yield 200 suburban lots. Each lot could be sold for several $1,000s. The total revenue from subdivision dwarfed whatever the mansion itself might bring at sale. The result was the most dramatic transformation in American residential landscape history. Where one family had walked through formal gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, 200 families now mowed quarter-acre lawns. Where a stable had housed 12 horses and a fleet of carriages, a row of attached garages sheltered Chevrolets and Fords. The suburban developments that replaced the estates were not ugly. In many were pleasant, tree-lined neighborhoods. But they were built on the graves of something extraordinary, and nobody paused to mark the burial. By 1950, the transformation was essentially complete. The Gold Coast had been gutted. The Hudson Valley had been decimated. Newport was a shadow. The great suburban estates that had ringed every major American city, from the main line of Philadelphia to the North Shore of Chicago, had been subdivided and demolished by the hundreds. 4,000 mansions had existed at the turn of the century. Fewer than 300 survived. 93% of the greatest building campaign in American domestic history had been erased in 50 years, and not a single bomb had fallen on American soil. Chapter 9. The Bones in the Museum. When the wrecking crews finished, The only traces left were fragments scattered across the city like relics from a vanished civilization. Walk through Central Park today, near the Vanderbilt Gate at 5th Avenue and 105th Street, and you will pass through a monumental wrought iron gate. It is graceful and elaborate, clearly the work of exceptional craftsmen. Most people walk through without stopping. Few know that these gates once stood at the entrance to the Cornelius Vanderbilt Mansion, the largest private residence in Manhattan, the house that was demolished to make way for Bergdorf Goodman. The gates survived because someone decided to save them. The house did not. This is the strange afterlife of the Gilded Age mansions. Fragments survive. The whole does not. In the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you can find mantelpieces removed from demolished townhouses. In the American Wing, period rooms recreate the interiors of vanished homes using salvaged paneling, chandeliers, and decorative plasterwork. The rooms are beautiful. They are also obituaries. Across the city, in lobbies and restaurants and hotel corridors, bits and pieces of the demolished world surface unexpectedly. A carved stone relief from a Fifth Avenue mansion embedded in the wall of a midtown office building. A stained glass window from a demolished church in the entryway of a steakhouse. Marble columns repurposed as decoration in buildings that have no structural need for marble columns. The auction houses conducted the dispersal with brisk efficiency. When a mansion was marked for demolition, its contents were sold, often over the course of several days. Silver, crystal, furniture, paintings, tapestries, and architectural salvage all went under the hammer. A carved oak staircase that had cost $10,000 to install might sell for $500. A set of bronze doors that had been cast in Paris might go for $1,000. The buyers were dealers, decorators, and occasionally museums, picking through the remains of a world that had taken decades to build and days to dismantle. The human cost extended far beyond the families who lost their homes. Entire communities had been built around the servant economies of the great estates. In Newport, the year-round economy depended heavily on the maintenance and staffing of the summer cottages. Servants who returned every season brought money into local businesses. The closure or demolition of an estate meant not just the loss of a house, but the loss of dozens of jobs and the income they pumped into the local economy. On Long Island, the transformation was even more dramatic. Towns that had existed primarily to serve the great estates found their economic base evaporating. Butchers who had supplied kitchens, florists who had decorated ballrooms, stable operators, laundresses, chimney sweeps, and ice deliverers all found their customer base shrinking and eventually disappearing. The art world absorbed what it could. Paintings that had hung in private galleries entered museum collections. Decorative arts that had furnished private rooms went into storage or display. But the architectural fabric, the carved stone facades, the elaborate ironwork, the coffered ceilings and mosaic floors, was mostly lost. Demolition was not a careful process. Wrecking crews worked fast. They pulled buildings apart from the top down with cranes and dynamite. Anything that could not be removed quickly was destroyed. Marble that had been shipped from Italy at enormous expense was crushed and used as landfill. Carved limestone was dumped. Bronze fixtures were melted for scrap. The physical substance of the mansions, the actual material that their builders had selected for its permanence, was treated as construction waste and disposed of accordingly. The irony was exquisite and cruel. The builders had chosen their materials for durability. Granite that would last 1,000 years. Marble that would outlast the builders by centuries. Steel beams rated for loads they would never bear. The materials were permanent. The economic conditions were not. And when the conditions failed, the permanent materials were hauled to landfills and crushed into gravel, proving that permanence in a material means nothing when permanence in a system does not exist. Some fragments found unlikely second lives. Carved stone elements from demolished mansions were incorporated into public buildings and parks. Ornamental ironwork from Fifth Avenue gates ended up protecting municipal gardens. Stained glass commissioned for private chapels appeared in suburban churches. The fragments dispersed across the landscape like seeds from a dead tree, taking root in places their creators never imagined. By 1950, a visitor to Fifth Avenue would find almost no trace of the residential street it had been 50 years earlier. A visitor to the Gold Coast would find suburban houses where estates had stood. A visitor to Newport would find a diminished colony, many of its grandest houses empty, boarded, or converted to other uses. 93% gone. Not gradually, the way ancient cities crumble over centuries, rapidly, deliberately, within the lifetime of people who had been born in the mansions and lived to see them demolished. The question was whether anything could be saved from the wreckage. Chapter 10. The 300 that refused to die. The mansions that survived did not outlast the others because they were stronger. They survived because they became something else entirely. Biltmore is the most dramatic example. George Vanderbilt's 250-room French chateau in North Carolina was, by any rational assessment, on the most impractical house ever built in America. After George's death in 1914, his wife Edith and their daughter Cornelia inherited a house that consumed money at a rate that threatened to exhaust even the Vanderbilt fortune. Edith Vanderbilt made the decision that saved Biltmore. She opened it to the public. In 1930, Biltmore became a tourist attraction, charging admission to visitors who wanted to see how the richest family in America had lived. It worked. By the 21st century, Biltmore draws more than 1 million visitors annually and generates over $50 million in revenue. The house that was built as a private retreat for one family now operates as a commercial enterprise, employing thousands. The transformation is total. George Vanderbilt would not recognize his home's function, but he would recognize its survival. The Breakers followed a similar path. After Gladys Vanderbilt sold the house to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1972, it became the crown jewel of Newport's house museum circuit. 450,000 visitors a year walk through the rooms where Cornelius and Alice Vanderbilt once entertained. They pay admission. They buy postcards. They keep the lights on. The Frick collection represents a different model of survival. Henry Clay Frick built his mansion at 1 East 70th Street with the deliberate intention of converting it to a public art museum after his death. He collected paintings by Vermeer, Rembrandt, and Bellini, not for private enjoyment, but for eventual public display. When the museum opened in 1935, the house achieved immortality through transformation. It is now considered one of the finest small museums in the world. Oheka Castle on Long Island survived through sheer stubbornness. Otto Hermann Kahn's 127-room mansion endured abandonment, military use, institutional use, vandalism, and over 100 arson fires before developer Gary Melius purchased it in 1984 and spent decades restoring it as a luxury hotel and event venue. The restoration cost tens of millions. It required rebuilding sections of the house from scratch, using photographs and original plans to recreate rooms that had been gutted by fire and neglect. Ohika's survival was not inevitable. It was a decision, renewed every year for decades, to keep spending money on a building that logic suggested should be abandoned. And other survivors found more modest transformations. Mansions became schools, their ballrooms converted to gymnasiums, and their dining rooms to cafeterias. Mansions became corporate headquarters, their drawing rooms filled with conference tables and filing cabinets. Mansions became convents, their bedrooms occupied by nuns instead of socialites. Each adaptation stripped away the original purpose while preserving the physical structure. Each survival story follows the same logic. The mansions that lasted were the mansions that stopped being mansions. They became museums, hotels, schools, conference centers, and parks. The ones that tried to remain private homes almost universally failed. The economics were simply impossible. No private family in the modern tax environment could sustain the cost of operating a 70-room house with a staff of 30. The survivors proved something paradoxical. The buildings were magnificent. The architecture was sound. The construction was, in many cases, superb. The houses did not fail as buildings. They failed as a way of life. The ones that found a new way of life endured. The ones that did not were demolished. The 300 survivors stand today as evidence of what was lost. For every mansion that became a museum, a dozen were demolished. For every Biltmore that found new purpose, 100 estates were subdivided into housing tracts. The survivors are not representative. They are the exceptions, the lucky few that found champions willing to spend the money and decades necessary to keep them standing. My Chapter 11, The Last Woman with 40 Servants. Julia Berwin spent every summer at the Elms with her 40 servants until she died in 1961 at 96. The last person alive still living the Gilded Age as it was meant to be lived. The Elms was the Newport summer cottage of the coal baron Edward Julius Berwind. Built in 1901, it was modeled on the Château d'Asnières near Paris. 48 rooms, formal gardens, carriage house, servant quarters housing a permanent staff large enough to operate a small hotel. After Edward Berwin died in 1936, his sister Julia maintained the house exactly as it had been. She changed nothing. She dismissed no one. While the world outside remade itself through depression, war, and social revolution, Julia Berwind kept 40 servants, observed the old rituals, and lived summer after summer in a house that was a monument to a vanished world. She was not eccentric. She was simply the last. Everyone else had given up. Everyone else had sold, converted, subdivided, or demolished. Julia Berwind alone maintained the original arrangement, the original staffing, the original way of life. She was a living ghost, the final inhabitant of a civilization that had been dead for decades. Picture what her summers must have been like in the 1950s. The other great houses on Bellevue Avenue were closing one by one. The social colony that had once filled Newport with the wealthiest families in America was a fraction of its former self. Julia's 40 servants kept the Elms running as it had always run. Meals served on china, rooms cleaned daily, gardens maintained to perfection. But the context had vanished. She was performing the rituals of a dead religion in a world that had forgotten the liturgy. Her persistence was, in its way, the most eloquent testimony to what the Gilded Age had been. Not the marble or the gilding or the scale, but the daily operation. the smooth functioning of a great household. 40 people working in concert to produce an experience of comfort and beauty for a single elderly woman. It was absurd by modern standards. It was also what the mansions had been built to provide. Julia Berwind was the last person on Earth who still received it. When she died in 1961, the elms nearly followed her. The property faced demolition until the Preservation Society of Newport County, which had been founded in 1945, purchased it and opened it as a house museum. The founding of the Preservation Society tells its own story. It was established not in the optimistic early days when the mansions were thriving, but in 1945, when the destruction was already far advanced. The society was born not from confidence, but from desperation. Its founders looked at what had been lost and realized that without intervention, everything would be lost. They were almost too late. By the time the preservation movement gained real legal force, most of the mansions were gone. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission was not established until 1965, prompted by one final demolition that crystallized the outrage. The Brokaw Mansion, a limestone Renaissance palace on the Upper East Side, was demolished despite organized opposition and public protest. Its destruction proved that good intentions were not enough. Legal protection was required. The Landmarks Law of 1965 gave the city the power to designate buildings as landmarks and prevent their demolition. It was a milestone in preservation history. It was also 50 years too late for the vast majority of the mansions it might have saved. This is the bitter pattern of preservation in America. It requires destruction to create the political will for protection. The mansions were not saved by foresight. They were saved when they were saved at all, by the horror of their loss. The 4,000 became 300, and only then did anyone build the legal framework that might have prevented the catastrophe. Julia Berwind, with her 40 servants, was not merely an anachronism. She was proof of what had been lost. In one woman, in one house, carrying on as though the world had not changed, was the clearest possible demonstration that the world had changed completely and permanently. Chapter 12. The most expensive illusion ever built. They used limestone and marble and granite and steel, and none of it mattered, because permanence was never in the materials. The builders of the Gilded Age mansions made a mistake that seems obvious in retrospect, but was invisible to them. They confused structural permanence with systemic permanence. They built with the hardest stone and the strongest steel, materials that would last centuries. But the system that supported the buildings, zero taxation, unlimited immigrant labor, and a culture that celebrated visible wealth, was as fragile as any arrangement in a democracy. European aristocrats had maintained their great houses for generations, sometimes for centuries. The Gilded Age builders looked at Blenheim Palace, at Chatsworth, at the chateau of the Loire Valley, and assumed they could replicate the model. They could not. The European estates rested on land ownership that was structural, legal, and often feudal in origin. The English country house was supported by agricultural rents, hereditary titles, and a class system embedded in law and custom. American wealth rested on industrial profits. It had no structural foundation. No law guaranteed that industrial fortunes would be untaxed. No custom guaranteed that immigrant labor would remain available. No social contract guaranteed that the culture would continue to celebrate the rich. Every condition that made the mansions possible was a choice, and choices could be reversed. They were reversed, all of them, in 31 years. The income tax reversed the financial condition. The Immigration Acts reversed the labor condition. The Depression reversed the cultural condition. 3 reversals, arriving in sequence and compounding each other's effects, stripped the mansions of every support simultaneously. William Andrews Clark's mansion at 965th Avenue stands as the perfect parable. 14 years to build, 14 years to occupy, 2 years to demolish. Roughly 3 decades from the first shovel of earth to the last fragment of rubble. Clark spent $7 million and commissioned 121 rooms and built an underground railroad to deliver coal to his boilers. He believed he was building something that would endure. He was buying something that would depreciate. This is the deepest truth of the Gilded Age mansions. Their builders thought they were creating permanent monuments. They were purchasing consumer goods, expensive consumer goods, beautiful consumer goods that required enormous ongoing expenditure to operate. But consumer goods nonetheless, dependent on conditions that could change and did change, 4,000 to 300. The mathematics of that ratio haunts any honest reckoning with the Gilded Age. 93% of the most ambitious private construction campaign in American history was erased within 50 years. Not by war, not by natural disaster, not by decay, by the entirely predictable operation of a democratic system, adjusting itself to new economic and social realities. The tax code changed because voters demanded it. The labor market changed because workers found better options. The culture changed because a depression made wealth obscene. Every one of these changes was rational. Everyone was democratic, and everyone was lethal to the mansions. The 300 that survived did so by abandoning their original purpose. They became museums and hotels and schools. They survive not as homes, but as attractions, visited by millions who pay admission to see how the wealthiest generation in American history once lived. The visitors walk through rooms designed for private use, now roped off and labeled with plaques. They admire the marble and the gilding and the scale, and then they leave, returning to a world in which such houses could not be built, could not be staffed, could not be maintained, and could not be justified. The last lesson is the simplest. Permanence built on impermanent conditions is the most expensive illusion money can buy. The Gilded Age builders believed they were founding dynasties. They were purchasing a lifestyle. When the 3 conditions that made the lifestyle possible were removed, the lifestyle ended, and the buildings it required became the most magnificent liabilities in American history. They used granite. They used steel. They used the finest marble the quarries of Italy could produce. And none of it, not one block, not one beam, not one polished slab, could protect them from the 3 forces that no amount of stone has ever withstood. A government that learned to tax, a labor force that learned to leave, and a culture that learned to judge. The 4,000 are gone. The 300 remain, each one a monument, not to the permanence of wealth, but to its fragility. Stand in the great hall of any surviving Gilded Age mansion and look up at the ceiling. The gilding is intact. The plaster is sound. The chandelier still catches the light. The architecture endures. It is everything else that vanished.